University of Nottingham from the FP Lab, and I want to talk about time. Just to explain the kind of things that we want to do, we want to write games. And in particular, I want to see what kinds of time transformations we can apply to games. So this is from a well-known game that I did not write. It's called Braid. And what it allows you to do is travel back in time when you lose or make a mistake. Let's see if, yeah. So the character falls, that's not what it's supposed to do, and you can press a button and then it starts rolling time back. And you have like 60 seconds of time buffer. And we wanted to see if this was possible to do in FRP. And there's a lot of conversations that don't seem to have to do with time, but actually do. For instance, this one. Imagine that you have a board game which is naturally discrete, but you want to animate it. Your animation occurs in continuous time, but your board exists in discrete time. If you add animations to your board, you're essentially adding visualization aspects to your mathematical description. But you need to animate it. So I think at some point we kind of forgot a little bit what FRP was about. FRP, the basic essence is that it's about values that change over time. It's about time. The FRP name is a bit misleading because it doesn't give you the most important keyword. So this is what we are actually using to write games. For instance, everything you see on the screen is something that changes over time. The mouse position changes, the animations change, the characters change, the level changes. All is a time-varying value. So here, we could think of the mouse position as a function that at any time has a value. And you can think of a picture of an animation, which is a time-varying picture, as, well, maybe you paint a red circle at the mouse position at that particular time. And the cool thing about this abstraction, and this is just a notion, you cannot actually run it this way, and I'll explain why in a minute, but the cool thing is that you can do time-based calculations. So you can say that instead of being at the mouse position, it is around the mouse position, and it progresses over time. And there's no time samples. There's no time deltas. There's no notion of sampling. This exists conceptually for all time. But you can do nasty things. For instance, you can start looking into the past. And if you can calculate the value of the signal, that's fine. But for something like the mouse position, you have to remember what the mouse position was, which means that you have to cache it, which means that you leak memory by design. And there's no way to know how much memory you're going to have to keep. So you have to keep it all. And this can get worse, because you can look into the future. You could express something like this. And what does it mean? If it's the mouse position, I don't know. But if it's the stock market, what does it mean that you can look forward? So, of course, FRP implementations do not allow you to do this. But the easiest way to do that is to eliminate the possibility of sampling signals at arbitrary times and kind of eliminating the possibility of manipulating time. And I think at some point we eliminated too much. And we focused more on the reactivity part, and we didn't enable the time transformations that we wanted to have with FRP initially. So what we use in practice, and in part is to avoid the problems that I just showed, is we use a different variant of FRP called arrowized FRP. And what it does is it doesn't let you sample signals at arbitrary times. And so the basic construct is that of a signal function, which is a causal, and by causal I mean, sorry that I go back, by causal I mean that it doesn't let you look into the future. So all these signals that come out of the output of a transformation are causal with respect to their inputs. The basic construct is a signal function. And it is a transformation that takes an input signal and returns an output signal. For instance, here we have a transformation that takes the mouse position as an input signal and returns a picture at that position, well, around that position as an output signal. This is arrow notation. I guess that more or less everybody is relatively familiar with it. You can think of this proc kind of as a lambda, but it's not quite the same thing. This is just a name. just a variable. There's nothing special about it. So unlike in the previous case where mouse position denoted something that came from the outside world, here there's not outside world yet. And one thing that is important is how we run it. Because this is sadly where sampling comes into place. Oh, no, that's fine. I thought it was too small. This is where sampling comes into place because we really sadly have to sample. So how this is executed in practice is that we provide input samples and the times when they occur, run the signal function, and then consume the outputs. And we do this over and over and over. Oh, sorry. So we removed too much from FRP by doing this. And if you look at this definition, for instance, how would you change the speed at which it progresses? You could, of course, multiply the time by something, but then you're making this signal function aware of something like time speed. So you're not essentially enabling time transformations. You also assume that time flows forward, which is fine. In nature, it tends to flow forward, but maybe there's interesting effects if we can make it flow back. And also the time domain in this particular implementation, and this is kind of more an implementation detail, is fixed to double precision floating point numbers. But it is 30% faster if you make them single precision floating point numbers. So it would be nice to have some flexibility there as well. And the whole system ticks in synchrony. So if you see this, when you provide the time for every single signal function in the system. So let's see what we can do about it. And what I did was start adding time transformations to an FRP implementation and see what happens and see what it looks like. And the simplest way that you can do this is with a time transformation function that takes the time delta and transforms it and returns a new one, and that's all you can, how you can combine signal functions running at different speeds. And with this, you would get the same animation as before, but twice, and one of them faster than the other. You could also make it run with a fixed speed by just providing always a constant speed at which you want to run it. But this is not expressive enough for games in general. What we want to do is we want to make the time vary as the game changes. And we can do so with a very similar signal function that just provides the time transformation to be applied at any time. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. Oh. Yeah. So I don't know if you can see it, but you can slow things down by just pressing a key and then letting it flow and slow it. This now slows for the whole system. And you can also speed things up a bit. And this is just that function. And I'll show in a minute how it's how signal functions are defined, and you'll see that the implementation is necessarily trivial. So the natural question now is, what happens if we make it negative? What if it rolls back? And there's two questions, actually. What does it do and what does it mean? And what does it do is easier to answer because you just have to try it. And there are constructs that just do the right thing. You roll back time and you see what you saw before. Or you see it behave backwards. For instance, integrals, which is something that this FRP implementation includes, works normally backwards. So if you move forward, you start integrating, and if you move backwards, you start removing some part of the integral. And this is, for instance, what you see here. If I do this, and then I do this, it starts rolling back, and what you see, the movement of this ball on the screen is only determined by integrals, by integrating the position and velocity, the velocity and acceleration. And all I have to do is feed negative time deltas, and it just keeps working fine. But not all of them work. And I'm going to explain one of them that doesn't work. And I know that there are people familiar with Yampa and FRP here, so maybe they will understand specifically internally why this is happening. But one of them is switch. And what switch allows you to do is you're applying a transformation, and at some point you decide to apply another. And how it works is that, for instance, in this example, we're trying to describe a bouncing ball, very similar to what we saw on the screen, but only with a vertical coordinate. So we start with an initial position and velocity, and it starts falling until it hits the floor, and then it bounces with the velocity inverted. Well, negated. And how switch works is that it expects a signal function that will produce, where is switch? A signal function that will produce an output and tell us when it needs to change, when it needs to apply a different transformation. And when it does, it will give an initial value, a C, that we can use to start the new transformation. So what you see here is that it starts falling until hit floor, provides us with the position and velocity at that time. And we use it here to restart the signal function from a new position with a new velocity. So essentially, it goes down, hits the floor. When it hits the floor, we start again going upwards. The problem with this is that once you switch, once you hit the floor, you forget the initial signal function that you were applying. So once you hit the floor, you can't roll back past that point. And these are the kind of design decisions that Yampa made right, because no one assumed that time was going to roll back, but now we need to re-implement. And this is actually really simple. All you have to do is keep the previous one, and then if you try to go past that point, use that one. And that's what we did. And I included in Yampa this reversible switch that just does the right thing. It just calculates what's the point when it's switched, the time when it's switched, and it either applies a normal switch forward, or the normal signal function forward, or the original one past that point backwards. And this is what you see here. So you can, by the way. If we don't do this, it would just get in the floor and start traveling backwards, and traveling into the floor. So these are actually quite interesting time effects. And you can think of other game features as also movements between time. For instance, a common thing that if you play games you have seen everywhere is that you can save the game state at some point and restart from that place. These are called checkpoints or save points. And in a game, you can reach a point in which there's some kind of flag or element, you touch it, and next time you die, you start from that point, like this. So this flag indicates that next time this character dies, it will not start from the beginning of the level. It will start from there. We have this now in Yampa with this kind of transformation. And essentially, it's extremely similar to reversible switch. All it's doing is keeping a signal function, and if you signal that you need to go back to that point, then it restarts from that point. But one thing that I did not address so far is that you can reverse signal functions, but the old values of signals are gone. For instance, if you were plugged to the mouse position is gone. And what I did is I added also a caching mechanism that allows you to keep part of the history so that you can actually remember everything that happened up to that point and be totally consistent with the signal up to that point. What you see here is that in the same way that I explained that going back in the past makes FRP leak, doing something like this makes FRP leak, and if you see the picture on the left, it just continues to leak upwards. So there's a way to limit the amount of memory and amount of samples that you want to keep. And a lot of this work and a lot of these features depend on a new kind of signal function construct. And here is where I kind of need a bit of help, because we think, or I think, and I think some of my co-authors also kind of believe that this new construct on the second line, this monadic stream function, is far more powerful than what we were using with signal functions. The Yampa signal function essentially is something like this. You give it the sample and the time when it occurs, and it gives you the current input, the output, and a continuation. But you can also do something like this. You have the input and return in a context, an output, and a continuation. Now, what happens if the monad here is the maybe monad? Anybody? These signal functions terminate. At some point, they stop producing output. And if it's the either monad, they terminate with a result. And if it's the list monad, they start splitting and splitting and splitting and producing more results, and then you get lists. And actually, the ball splitting mechanism that you saw in the game works exactly like that. And if you add the reader monad, then you get the Yampa monad. If you add the reader monad with time in the environment, then you get the Yampa monad that has time. But you could also add other time notions. And a question that emerges once you add these new times is, how do you combine them? If you have a game that has both of them, how do you combine them? And of course, you could use the same kind of time transformation that I explained before, but there's games in which that's not enough, which is the one that I showed at the beginning, which you want to coordinate two systems running at different speeds. And because now we have a monad, what we can do is we can add to this monad a state or a writer that tells us how much time has actually passed, and make sure that two systems that run at different speeds, one of them runs several times until it catches up with the other, so we can synchronize them. In the paper, I also explain how to freeze completely a subnetwork, which is something that some FRP implementations have done. And you can essentially freeze it and not pull it at all, not traverse it, and then restart it when time starts progressing again for that subnetwork. So this is the time transformations in Yampa are included already in the latest release. There's an FRP implementation based on monadic string functions, which is also open source, and there's a branch with these transformations. And this game is also open source. And yeah, you can contribute, you can play it, you can add levels or add features or whatever. So this is obviously not the whole picture. This is actually mostly implementation stuff. But we need to understand what it means. And we need to have a proper conversation about time. So we need to revisit FRP and understand the principles and how time plays a role, and maybe redesign it so that, yeah, we make sense of all of these features. And in particular, if you know this film, you know that how he explained that time travel works in this case is that you can go back in time and fork the timeline and do something else. Whereas here, if we have a switch which is not reversible, we can go to the future, have some effect that is completely reversible, and then when we try to roll back, we fork the timeline. And then we go back to a timeline that didn't actually exist. So it's a bit weird, this effect, but it's extremely useful in games. And yeah, all I want is actually to start a conversation, to revisit this topic, and to understand more about other FRP implementations and how we could come up with a simpler abstraction that would allow them to do what they're doing, but also express continuous animation, continuous behavior, and time reversal, and these time jumps in a more natural way. And by the way, this game, and sometimes, well, if you have seen me around talk, I have a company that does sell Haskell Games, and sometimes I get to see people come in and play these games, and it's quite nice to see them engage with the game, and there's they kind of like leave behind everything at some point, and they just engage with it, and their problems are gone. And I think there's a deep meaning to what we do. Of course, that's why I do it. But I just wanted to say that in the same way that we have to focus on the meaning of things in FRP and in the abstractions that we use, this carries a meaning for me in particular, because the book on the left and the man on the right is the reason why I've spent the last 10 years doing what I'm doing. So this game was written for Paul Hudak's memorial when my supervisor, Henrik Nilsson, went to speak there. And it's kind of like a tribute to his work. If you see this game online, I hope you at least remember that there's a meaning to us also there. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Please. Attack me. Go. Yes.
So you started off by saying, well, the reason we had analyzed FRP is so that we didn't get the state space associated with time travel. And then you're reintroducing time travel, which presumably means we will then need to if we use your switchy thing.
Yeah.
To remember the whole history of the game right back to the beginning. Can we just reintroduce the very problem that Jansel was introduced to solve?
In part, yes. So what happens is that the way that time travel is implemented, you don't always have to keep the history. There are ways of keeping the history, and then you become consistent with the past. But there are also ways, for instance, in this game, one thing that I'm doing here is when I reverse, I'm entering new input. So essentially, the input signal is not consistent with its past, so to speak. Do you get where I'm going? Is it more or less understood? Normally, if you go back in time, you would expect the input signal to be consistent with the past, which is why you need to remember the past, which is why it leaks. But here, it isn't, because it isn't necessarily consistent with the past. We give ways of doing that, and those leak, and there are ways to limit how much they leak, but they need to be used with care. In the game that I showed, the braid game that I showed at the beginning, by the way, that is implemented using leaking. They limit the amount to 60 seconds. They limit the amount of memory that you can leak, but it is the only way that we see to implement it. If you see a better way, please.
Thank you. That was really interesting. You talked about reversing time, but it sounded like the reversal time happened outside the system. You got this arrow running, and then you press a button, they now make time go backwards.
The time travel happens in this function. Yeah, so this function is the one that also allows you to do time travel, because you can use a time transformation function that negates the time deltas and lets you travel backwards, so to speak. So you can enclose a specific signal function and allow only that one to travel backwards, while the rest of the game travels forwards. And in the braid video that I showed, they actually use that. You can only reverse certain things, but others keep traveling forward, and that's what we want. We want that local control.
Okay, that was right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the book. Did you need the feeling that although something was 25 years ago, that there's still also the things to do? We're mentioning, for instance, that as soon as you allow to take the signal value at time -2, then there is necessity on memory leak. No, -2 is not. Memory leak is defined to caches 2 seconds or 2 units of time of the signal. That's fine. So there should be some timing to ensure that the caching can be done.
Okay. How do you ensure that you only cache? How do you decide statically that you only need to cache 2?
You need some dependent fact that do check how you are handling the values, and so this has been done in discrete time by Milan audit with this I think, and I'm sure it can be extended to.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Also, what I observed is that there is this workshop
one. Oh.